What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from Y0 from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and we're back with another Stein Format video, the format based around SJC San Jose in December 2006, right before the emergency ban list that hit Cyber-Stein. And the format's been pretty fun to explore so far. I mentioned in the past that I'm not really going to be focusing too much on it because, I do feel like Stein OTK is very, very dominant in it. And the next format, Chimera Tech format, it's the one basically right after the emergency ban list. And so it's a lot more interesting and diverse. And so a lot of the more rogue strategies I'd be showing off in this format, I think can flourish more in Chimera Tech format. But because I'm going to be showing less videos in this format, my typical sort of like deck building video that I've been doing for the past couple formats is going to be a bit different because, I'm not really going to be building a rogue deck from scratch to play in this format. So I've got to mix things up a little bit. So I figured I'd take this time to sort of briefly talk about how you can adapt an existing list that's already out there in the format to more suit your own sort of tastes. And I will say, in general, before you do this, it's good to play a couple games with the deck. But I'm sort of just taking this from a theoretical, okay, I'm looking at the deck right now. There's some things I just don't like about it right away. What can I do to change it? And again, as I mentioned, you should play a couple games with this beforehand because, occasionally there will be things that come up that maybe you didn't think about. Like maybe you're wondering like, oh, why is, Mecha Dog Marin in this deck? I don't get why this card's here. You take 1,000 life points when it's destroyed by battle. Like that doesn't make sense to me. But maybe over the course of a couple games, you realize, oh, okay, it actually is important to have a monster you can just summon out and crash into your opponent's stuff and deal 1,000 damage. So the deck we're sort of adjusting here is Chainburn, and this was actually the list used by Jeffrey Fisicaro in the SJC San Jose tournament. And I think this list is pretty good overall. There are just some things that I would definitely change with it. So we'll be diving into those changes that I think I'm going to make here and the debates that I sort of have over this sort of deck. But if you like what you see here or want to see more videos like this in the future, definitely like, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff for the algorithm and stuff. But also, in the comments, I like discussing these sorts of things with you. So let me know if you like this sort of style of deck building video and just seeing my process with this sort of thing. And I could make more like this in the future. Or if you just prefer building from the bottom up, just, completely from scratch. Anyways, let's dive in to the deck list here. So if you don't know, Chainburn is basically a deck that revolves around things like Chain Strike, which is a quick play spell that says activate only as Chain Link 2 or higher. Inflict 400 damage to your opponent times the Chain Link number of this card. You can activate this effect or this card if multiple cards or effects with the same name are in that chain. So basically the idea is you play a bunch of chainable cards and you fire Chain Strike to deal a ton of damage to your opponent. And this can be a little bit tough to maneuver because, again, you can't have multiple effects or names of cards in the same chain, so that can be a bit awkward. This deck can also be tough to face against, experienced players because a lot of the times, once you know how to play against this deck, it becomes a lot less good. But the deck is still very individually strong in this format, and part of that is because a lot of other decks are playing Cyber-Stein OTK, and that deck needs to be above 5,000 life points to win, and this deck can drop your opponent down below 5,000 life points, pretty easily. So, we're looking at this deck. The first thing that I like to do whenever I'm adjusting a list is if I download the list, I like to replace the OCG arts with the TCG arts. That's just a personal preference on my part. But so Ring of Destruction here, I'm going to replace it with the fire one. I didn't do this in my last Stein OTK video because I forgot about it. But I do like the fires on the Ring of Destruction there. Tremendous Fire also has, I believe it's TCGR. Yeah, I like the blue robes. I'm sure that some people like the, no robes at all, but I like the blue robes on it. And I think that's it for the TCG arts that I can see here in the main deck. So, that first step, done. Okay, good. We're already one step into the process. But the next thing that I look at is what is the deck trying to do and how does each card in this deck contribute to that win condition? And are there any other cards that I might want to include in this deck? So firstly, with Chainburn, it's pretty easy to look at just the burn cards first, just to see them in a vacuum. So we got triple Chain Strike. I think that's good for a deck that is based around Chain Strike. Also, as a note, you can actually do something interesting with Chain Strike where you can activate 2 Chain Strikes in the same chain, because when you activate the second Chain Strike, there are not multiple cards or effects in the same chain at that point. So you can indeed double up on this thing. And that is very good to know if you're playing the deck. So I like 3 Chain Strike. I think it's pretty good. If you wind up with all 3 in hand, it can get awkward, but we're playing ways to draw through our deck a bit more quickly. So I like the Chain Strikes here. Poison the Old Man, I think, is also a very, very flexible burn card here. Tremendous Fire, I also like. It can't be chained to things, but it's great to start your chain. And this sort of gets into the philosophy of Fire. Like Pui on her channel has a really good sort of turbo burn list that is very interesting, and she goes into depth about how to build a burn deck that's getting very, very aggressive there. And basically, you want to make sure that every card that you're playing can sort of guarantee you some amount of burn damage if you're playing a ton of burn cards. And you want to make sure that you're killing your opponent very quickly, and so you want to max out on burn cards that do a lot of burn. So Tremendous Fire is definitely a pretty good one there, getting in for 1,000 damage. Just Desserts is also a decent burn card, especially with the Ojama Trios. It can potentially backfire, not do over 1,000 damage, but if you've got the Ojama Trio online, then it could deal 1,500, which is pretty good, and it is a chainable, which is important for this deck, because again, you want to be chaining as much as possible here. Ojama Trio is also a chainable, and it pairs with the Just Desserts, so I kind of view it as a burn card. Now, it can be a bit awkward, because you could say, Just Desserts plus Ojama Trio is basically 2 cards dealing a total of 1,500 damage. So that's 750 damage per card, and is it worth it to do that? But you've also got to consider, if you're doing this in a Chain Strike chain, that also adds 400 to each of these. So that's 1,150 damage per card, if you conceptualize it that way. Also, once you've activated one Ojama Trio, your other Desert also get turned online. So it's not quite the even 50-50 split of that 1,500 damage that I mentioned there. But I think that this is a very, very good card to include. You kind of do have to include 3 copies of it just to make sure that you open it early, so that way you can do your Just Desert play. But that is kind of awkward. So maybe that's one spot where, if you do want to mix around some cards in the deck, maybe you want to cut out the Ojama Trios. But I do think that they're too essential to turning on things like the Secret Barrels, like the Just Desserts, that it is important to keep them in here. Speaking of Secret Barrel's in here as well. This is also a very, very good card compared with a lot of the other cards in the deck, like, Morphing Jar, which I'll get to when we get to the draw engine of this deck. So I do like Secret Barrel here. If your opponent has just 5 cards, it's 1,000 damage right there, and oftentimes your opponent will have that amount of cards. So, and again, you've got to consider adding another 400 damage to the effective damage that it's doing. That's pretty good there. Ring of Destruction, this is kind of more of an awkward burn card, same with Magic Cylinder, because they rely on your opponent doing things to actually, go off, which can be a bit tricky. But I do think that the amount of damage that they're likely to deal is worth playing, because you're likely going to use it on a monster with more than 1,000 attack and more than 1,500 attack even. So I do think that these cards are pretty good to include. Same with Dimension Wall, because, it's sort of a similar case as Cylinder, where, you will be able to get in that damage there. So I do like these 3 cards, even though they do rely on your opponent's actions. I do think that they make sense to have here. And that's going to do it for the burn cards the deck is already playing. If you want to look up, other burn cards, what you can do is make sure that you have the date set to September 2006 for the limited list there, and sort by release date, because that makes it a bit easier. But what you can do is in the description, you can type Inflict, and that should, narrow down to the cards that actually burn. Largely, you have things like White Magical Hat or Mass Sorcerer, because when they inflict damage, it does something. But this can sort of narrow down the burn cards that are available to you a little bit more. And just looking through these, a Ceasefire is a good one. That might be something we consider. I'm just going to put that in there. It is a bit awkward because you don't get the guaranteed burn off Just Desserts with your Ojama Trios, so maybe that's something that you don't want to include, but that's something to consider at least. Let's see, what else do we have here that's good? And also, it's important to note we want things that potentially chain, because that would be good for our chain strikes. And so you might consider Darkroom Nightmare as being a good card here, because it's oh, it deals 300 damage to your opponent. But the issue is that this puts multiple effects of Darkroom Nightmare in the chain if you're chaining a ton of burn damage together. And so I think that's a bit awkward there. Maybe it doesn't quite work that way, but I think I don't know, Darkroom Nightmare is weird with stacking chains on things, but either way, I don't think it's the best in this deck, because, it's a continuous spell, so you can't use it in the chain. It's sort of just the start of a chain, and that's a bit awkward there. So, let's see what else here. We could do, I don't think Dark Snake Syndrome does quickly enough to be worth it, so I don't think that's worth it. Gravekeeper's Curse is 500 damage, that's something, but I don't really think it's worth including, because 500 is a bit not good in this deck. Nightmare Wheel might seem like a good card. You can use it to start a chain, so that's actually something. That is something to consider. honestly. But like this deck is more of like a turbo burn deck rather than just sitting on our cards and waiting. I'll consider Nightmare Wheel though. I just think like if you're using to stop an attack, you've got like Cylinder, you've got Wall. Those are a little bit better. But Nightmare Wheel does have the benefit of being able to be activated whenever, not just when your opponent declares an attack. So that does give it some, interesting application to this deck. I'm gonna consider Nightmare Wheel. I don't know how good it is. I don't think we need Escawala here because we're not really focusing on monsters. Monsters are kind of bad for this deck because they can't really be used for the chaining. And Panda, I think that we don't really need to use this. It doesn't really contribute to the chaining, as I mentioned. It can pair well against Ogeometrio, so that is nice. But we're not really attacking much at all, so all of our opponent's battle traps will be used against something like Panda if we bring it out in attack. So I don't really think it's the best. Let's see what else here. Stealth Bird we could include if we're sort of slowing things down a bit. Stealth Bird also is an effect that continues to activate over time, so it's the start of these chains if we want to go for that. So that is something. It also deals 1,000 damage, so that's pretty good as well. So I do like the idea of Stealth Bird here, but it might be a little bit too slow for the deck that we're playing here. Yeah, just going through the rest of these, I don't really think there are like too many good ones for us. We could also consider going up to the third Mechadog Marin, because that is a burn card. I sort of just wanted to consider the non-monsters first before we get to the monsters. But, this is a burn card. The issue with this is that it activates in damage step, so it can't really start your chains, but it does deal 1,000 damage, so that is something as well. It's just whether we want to prioritize the Mechadog Marins, which, are a bit more resilient if we don't have the stallier parts of our deck online, like Gravity Bind, for instance, or if we want to prioritize the Stealth Birds, which can start our chains for Chain Strike, and but do have the downside of being, kind of useless if they're destroyed by battle. So that is an interesting question for us to ask there. Let's see, what else here can we do? I don't really think there are too many better burn options coming later down the pipeline here, but it's good just to be, full on, exploring all possibilities if we've got them. But yeah, this is up to the current set here. We could do Chain Detonation, but 500 damage, considering the Philosophy of Fire, how much damage on average these cards are doing, I don't really think this is that good. Blast Asmodean, well, this is, I think this does stack multiple times on the chain, so I think that this would be bad for our Chain Strike deck, but I don't quite know. Yeah, and that should do it because we go up to Cyber Dark Impact and some of the promos here. So I think Phantom Beast Wildhorn's the last promo we go up to in terms of the afflicting cards. And I don't think any of these other cards are really that important to include. So that's going to do it for the additional burn cards that I'm considering adding. But, I mentioned the burn engine. We've also got a bit of a draw engine here, which is very important because, they add to the chain, they draw you into more burn cards, and that's very, very good. So the draw engine that we've got some accumulated fortunes here. So this, if it's activated as chain link 4 or higher, you get to draw 2 cards, which is very good at drawing deeper in your deck. Basically Pot of Greed, especially because you're chaining so much that you can activate this a lot of the time. And I believe it is, again, just like with Chain Strike, you can use multiple of these in the same chain because, when you activate it, multiple cards and effects have not been used in the same chain. But that is awkward for your Chain Strike deck because you want to be using Chain Strike as the last link in the chain, and so if you activate multiple accumulated fortunes in that chain, it gets a bit awkward, but I guess you can activate it after the Chain Strike there, so that's something that can come up. We got Triple Jar of Greed. I think it's very, very good at drawing deeper in the deck. We've got Double Reckless Greed, and also we've got this Morphing Jar here. I think this is important enough to talk about in the draw engine section. Again, if your opponent attacks into it, you don't get to chain anything to it because it's in the damage step, so that's kind of unfortunate. But I do think that, this card is still very important to include, and if you activate on your turn, you do get to chain things to it, so that's very, very nice. So I do think this is a very, very good piece of our draw engine. We can actually, just type in draw into our description thing and see what else we get. Upstart Goblin we could play, but this is sort of like an anti-burn card because we're drawing 1 deeper, but we're also giving our opponent 1,000 life points, which is what we do not want to be doing. So I don't want this. We have the Grateful Charity as well. I forgot to mention that. That's very, very good in this deck. Drawing deeper into the deck and pitching 2. I don't know. There aren't really too many other ones. I think Good Goblin Housekeeping is one that I had in mind. So, this is, another trap. Get to draw cards equal to the number of Good Goblin Housekeeping cards in your graveyard plus 1. Then select 1 card from your hand. Return to the bottom of the deck. So, it can be a bit awkward because, you draw a card with it, and then if you don't have any Good Goblin Housekeeping cards in your graveyard, then it basically doesn't even do anything. You just put a card on the bottom of your deck. But when we're playing things like Ojomatrios, which potentially if you draw 2 of them aren't really that good, I do think it can be good to have the good Goblin Housekeepings here. And also it's another chain for our chain link, and just filtering out, to be able to better stack our chain links in the future, I think it is very good. Other than that, though, Pot of Avarice we can't really use because we're not playing many monsters. Yeah, I think that is probably it. Maybe Cyber Fiends is the defensive card, but I don't really think this goes with our game plan, so I'm not really going to consider it. Iris the Earth Mother is very funny, but I don't think it's worth playing because we don't play enough monsters to justify its inclusion. So I think that is going to be it for the additional cards in the draw engine. We could also play things like Magical Mallet or Reload or things like that to try and draw deeper. We could play things like Dekoichi just to draw deeper in that way. But, well, with Reload and Magical Mallet, it's just a strict -1, which this deck doesn't really want to be doing that much. I mean, yes, Good Goblin Housekeeping is a -1 when it's first activated, but you have 2 of it, and so potentially it becomes a jar of greed later on, especially if you're filtering through your deck a lot. So I do ultimately like this card in the deck. Maybe that's a mistake, but I think it does have potential here, so I do want to test it out. But I think everything else is kind of awkward there for it. But okay, those are the new cards that I'm considering. We still have a couple more cards in the original deck that I didn't talk about, namely, the stalling engines. So you've got Threatening Roar, double Waboku here. Not sure why they went with... okay, this makes sense, because you want to be able to use 2 of these in the chain to potentially buff up your chain a bit more for a chain strike play, so it makes sense that they're going with the different names here. So I think that makes sense, and I think Waboku is... Well, I think Waboku is generally the better card here, because if you activate on your turn, you do get some value off it, potentially. So yeah, I get why they went with 2 Waboku, 1 Threatening Roar there. Scapegoats here as well to stall a bit. Yeah, I mean, not much to say about this card. It maybe is a bit undervalued compared to some other ones, but you can chain it to things, which is important. So I think it does make the cut over someone with level limit area B. Gravity Binds here, again, you can chain this to other things, so that does put it above level limit area B in my mind. And that's going to do it for the stall part of the deck, I think. We could potentially add more to the stall side of things if we want to, if we're worried about that sort of thing. So we could have more T-Roars or Wabokus or things like that. But I think that might make us a little bit too passive, so I'm not necessarily sure I want to do that. But it's something to consider here. So, in terms of the other monster that we didn't talk about, Sangan gets a monster from deck to hand, so that can be pretty good. Although, I mean, deck thinning is good. Like, I don't know, it just seems kind of underwhelming overall. So I'm not exactly sure if I want it in the deck, which sounds weird. But, like, I don't know, it just feels awkward in the deck. Like, what does it do? It just, basically, if your opponent attacks into it, it gets you a monster that does burn damage on the next turn, potentially, like Mecha-Dog Marin. But then you're telegraphing that to your opponent so they can play around it a little bit more. I don't like Sangan in this deck, I'm going to be honest. I'm not sure if it's worth playing here. That seems really weird to say, but I do think that it's just not worth it in this deck. So I'm going to cut it down a bit. Exiled Force. I get why this is here. This can also be an effect that we can chain things to, so that's kind of nice. Especially because, once we use this effect, if we chain Justice to it, the monster that we want to destroy is still going to be on the field, so that's kind of nice. But I feel like it's just better not to play it. I feel like we can play other things instead, maybe more stall cards instead, so that way their monsters don't really affect us as much. So I'm going to cut down this as well. Marin is interesting. The thing about Marin that makes it a little bit awkward, in my opinion, is if you're playing things like Gravity Bind, you can wind up with situations where the Marin is just dead, doesn't deal any burn damage. And also, like, I don't know, if you're thinking about, like, Marin versus, like, Dimension Walls or things like that, like, Marin basically, I mean, you can attack into an opponent's monster with Marin, so that is a nice thing about it. But a lot of times, you're going to be setting this, your opponent's going to be attacking into it, and they're going to be taking 1,000 damage from that. But things like Dimension Wall can just deal that 1,000 damage better, because, if you're taking a full-on direct attack and you activate Dimension Wall, then that's going to deal more than 1,000 damage, most likely. So, I don't know how I feel about the Marin. Marin is very good, and there are certain circumstances where it can come up. It's basically like another card that says, burn your opponent for 1,000 damage. But is it better than Stealthbird? Because Stealthbird also reads, burn your opponent for 1,000 damage. I guess, if we're playing this deck, we're less focused on the stall. So, maybe it won't come up as much. Oh, I'm just also going to cut Ceasefire here. I don't really think it's that good in this deck. I included it for completeness sake there. but I don't really think we're playing enough sets to justify it. And also the tokens are not effect monsters, so those won't be dealt as burn damage to our opponent. So yeah, I'm going to cut the ceasefire. I mean, you could argue that on average it would be 1,000 damage, but there are just situations where like, our opponent has one monster and you're just beating him with that and it's just 500 damage. So that's not really worth it. I'd rather have a Nightmare Wheel than a ceasefire in those cases because yes, this is 500 damage as well, but it stacks over time. Nightmare Wheel might be something that I consider in the deck, but it also is a bit awkward because you can wind up in situations with Nightmare Wheel where it's clogging up your back row and you don't necessarily want that. I don't know. Nightmare Wheel's... It is weird. I don't know if the once per turn during your standby phase, inflict 500 damage to your opponent starts a chain. I think it does actually, because it's got the colon there. So actually, if this starts a chain, in your standby phase, that seems pretty good, because it's just starting a chain like every turn. And so I guess there is some setup there, because like oftentimes we're using our chainable traps in our opponent's turn, so it can be a bit awkward on our turn if we're starting a chain that way. But I do kind of like the fact that it starts a chain. And that's dealing 500 damage. If we get this on field for 2 turns, that's 1,000 damage. So that's kind of nice. It also provides us with some stall, which is also pretty decent, I think. Yes, we're playing a more aggro deck, but like I do think it is good to stall out a little bit. I mean, that's why we're playing the Gravity Bind here, because, if our opponent can't attack, then our game plan becomes a lot easier. So I do like the Nightmare Wheels here, actually. I'm talking myself into it. I'm talking myself into the Nightmare Wheels. But, the ruling on the starting a chain or not could come up. So, yeah, I don't know. I'll decide to have them here. I think I am going to cut the Marins. That seems weird. But I value the Stealth Birds a little bit more, especially if we're keeping in the Nightmare Wheels, which I think we are going to do. Unfortunately, we don't have the TCGR of Nightmare Wheel here. I'm pretty sure that's the only art of it. Let me just check on DB. Yeah, the only art of it, unfortunately. Damn. I like the green guy, but, that's how it goes sometimes. But, we've cut down to a fairly, lean deck, I think. I'm trying to think of what other cuts we want to make. And in a deck like this, I don't necessarily think you need to be at exactly 40 cards, but I do think it's not bad to be at 40 cards. I could cut the Scapegoat, maybe. Like, what does Scapegoat do for us? It's another stall card, right? But is it worth having that stall card? I don't know. I don't know about that. Yeah, I'm going to cut the Scapegoat, I think. Dimension Wall also is kind of on the chopping block here. It is a bit awkward, but like, I don't know, especially since we're only playing one copy of it. And maybe we're just playing one copy because it's something our opponent isn't expecting, but it needs a much more narrow activation window than something like Nightmare Wheel does. And it will deal more damage on average than Nightmare Wheel. So I don't know why I'm using Nightmare Wheel as like the new benchmark for these traps, but I do think it's like, if we're including the Nightmare Wheels, which we're not in the original deck, we do have to compare, like, okay, is it worth including these, or is it better to play something like the original deck was playing, like Dimension Wall, right? I think Dimension Wall is a little bit flawed here, especially if we're playing these Stealth Birds now. I think Dimension Wall isn't as good. It can be good to start a chain, but like, I'm not feeling Dimension Wall as much. Maybe there's a major mistake, but I think I might cut the Dimension Wall down. I'm going to cut the Dimension Wall, and if I'm cutting Dimension Wall, I might as well cut Magic Cylinder. It feels really weird to do that. But it's like, if you think about it, like, you want things that you can use at any point, right? And you can't activate those at any point. So it does make it awkward. The damage that they deal is very nice. I'm not going to lie about that. But again, that's kind of situational. You wind up in situations where like you are walled up and you're feeling fine and you don't need those cards at all. And then there's kind of bricks. So yeah, I'm good with that. I'm good with cutting that. Okay, so what do we got now? We got a pretty lean 41 cards here. Like, is there anything that I would really cut from this? Probably not. I think all these cards are really good. There's also an argument for playing more Threatening Roars or Wobokus here as well to, sort of like increase our stall power. You could also potentially cut one entirely. I don't necessarily want to cut one entirely, because I feel like they are valuable when you draw them. It makes me feel weird, but I think I am going to lock it in at 41 cards. I'm going to lock it in there. And, you know, you might be wondering, like, you're playing so many draw cards. Why are you locking in at 41 cards? Well, the draw cards aren't necessarily here to, like, draw into specific pieces of interaction that we want. They're mainly here to, you know, start chains and also replenish our hand with things that can start more chains or burn our opponent more. So I feel like it is fine playing 41 cards because, you know, all these cards, I think, do something in the deck. And I think it is good. There is also an argument for, like, cutting the good Goblin Housekeepings. But I do think that they can come up. I think sometimes you just want to shuffle back a dead card like Trio. Trio, I think, is the deadest card in our deck now. Because, like, once we activate one Trio, if our opponent doesn't have a way to clear it, then Trio's just kind of dead in the water. So, yeah, I like the current build of this. I like this build that I've cooked up here. Maybe it's wrong. Maybe in the future, I'll have to replace these Stealth Birds with Mechadog Barons. But we'll just have to see. I think on average, the Stealth Bird can get the same amount of damage that Mechadog Baron can. But also it starts a chain that you can chain to. It activates every turn. So I do like it overall, especially when we're going with the Nightmare Wheels here. So I think I'm going to lock it in. Looking at the side deck, this is a smokescreen into Stein OTK. So that is a fine smokescreen to go into. I think that this is fine. I'll keep that as the game plan because I could see other decks like potentially, you know, signing things like Decree or things to stop this deck. But if we Stein, like, if we side hard into Stein OTK, then Decree doesn't really do anything against us. Oh, we should fill out the Fusion deck here a bit. Generally, when building a Fusion deck for a format like this with an unlimited Fusion deck, I just like to go for, like, variety. So I'm going to cut one of the twins here. They had double Cyber Twin Dragon there. The Jumbo Drill can't be summoned off Stein, so I'm just going to cut it. It's a very cute card, but it's not really something that I feel like, you know, could come up in any reasonable sort of situation. In order to more easily filter this out, I'm going to look up Monster Fusion by release date, just see what could potentially come up. I think Dragoness could definitely come up because we're playing Floodgates. So, you know, maybe that is something that happens, that we need to get in that 1200 damage with it somehow. In terms of the next card that comes up, people do play Darkfire in the extra deck sometimes, so we don't play meta, so it won't come up. I'm just thinking, like, if we take control of our opponent's Stein, or if we just go into the Stein OTK here, what do we want to bring out? And I don't think Dragoness will come up in a meaningful capacity. Last Warrior can come up. Balter. We've got a Balter. Do we have a... We don't have a Fiend Skull Dragon, so I'll put that in. We got Senshi. Reaper we have in the extra deck as well. King could maybe come up. I'm going to put in some other cards before King. Darkblade the Dragon Knight's pretty good here. They've got Gatling. King's Dragoon can come up a lot of the time. Let's see here. Blader the effect can come up. It's kind of awkward, but I'll put it in for, you know, if that effect ever comes up, like the third effect, basically, where our opponent's 3 cards, they can't activate effects. And yeah, that should do it, I think, in terms of most of them. So I will put it in the King, just because it can maybe be something that happens where we want to stall out a bit, lock up their zones, maybe. But yeah, I think this is a pretty good extra deck, you know, good toolbox. It's also something good, like, if you want to know, like, let's say your opponent's on Stein OTK, and you're like, what fusion monster do they have access to that might come up here? Then you can look into this and be like, okay, you know, maybe they could go into Last Warrior or something if they want to give me trouble, or something like that. So I think it's good having this, even if you don't really anticipate going into the Stein OTK stuff that much. But this deck does smokescreen side into the Stein OTK. Now, with a smokescreen side, it is generally good to consider, okay, what am I swapping out? And that is a reason to potentially go down to 40 cards exactly, because when you're swapping into Stein OTK, you kind of want to draw the pieces of your combo as quickly as possible. But I think we're playing enough draw engine here to be fine with that. And also, like, you could definitely cut the 41st card after testing this out a bit more. Like, this is definitely a bit of a different build than the one that was used in SJC San Jose by Jeffrey Fisicaro. But because of that, you know, there is some testing that needs to be done with it. Maybe some cards I'm overvaluing. Like, I definitely see cutting the good Goblin Housekeeping in the future. That just might not be a good card for this deck. Maybe it's too slow because, you know, the first one that you activate is just kind of a hard minus. But I do think it is still worth playing here. But maybe I'll change my mind on that in the future and cut it for something else. And doing that can easily cut the deck down to 40 cards because I just replace these 2 with 1 additional card and then we're at 40. So, yeah, I don't know. I think that, like, it is good to consider, though, what we're cutting here exactly to get down to Stein OTK. I'm not quite sure. I mean, let's think about this. So we have 15 cards here. And what I'm going to do just to make this easier is I'm going to save the deck, set as default, and just go into solo mode with siding. And this is a way, like, I mean, you could just also, let's do not watching. It's good to go in solo mode for like test hands of things. I think this is a very, very good test hand. Let's just play out this test hand while we've got it, just to see how it's looking. I mean, we can just go for Graceful right now. We could also have saved the Graceful for starting a chain, but I think it's fine to do this. What are we pitching? Do we need one Secret Barrel? I think we don't need. Nightmare Wheel is, I think, a better card than Waboku, maybe. Oh, this is tough. Man, this deck's tough to play. That's going to be something that I'm going to be experimenting with. But this is a sort of meaningless test hand, so let's just go for that. And let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because heavy ain't real. So now if our opponent starts a chain, let's say they've got a monster or something, or they start that, we can at least chain some stuff to it. Maybe I should have taken Waboku in case they had a Heavy Storm here, because if they go Heavy Storm, I chain Waboku, chain Secret Barrel, chain Jar, chain Reckless, chain Strike, and that's a lot of damage coming in. But if they chain Heavy here, either way, I've got Reckless, Jar, Secret Barrel, and chain Strike. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So chain Strike would be 1,600, and then Secret Barrel, they probably have, well, they'd have 6 cards in hand, so it's not quite enough to drop them out of the Stein TK range. So that is a bit awkward for us, but I'm just hoping they don't have Heavy Storm. We've got Tremendous Fire in the follow-up. They can't kill us with the Stein TK, so, you know, that's kind of nice. But anyways, let's just go to begin siding, because this is why I wanted to go into this mode, because now we can sort of like, look, okay, let's say we're siding in everything here. Let's just pick the 15 cards that we want to side out. So let's consider what we're probably siding out here. Of course, it probably also depends on whether our opponent is on Stein TK of their own. Like, we might want to keep in the Threatening Roar of the Wabokus and stuff like that. But I think of these cards, we can definitely cut the Ojama Trio and just Desserts package. I think that makes sense to cut. I think Nightmare Wheel can come up. Good Goblin Housekeeping could also come up. Tremendous Fire we could probably cut. It does deal us 500. Cut the Chain Strikes as well. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's 12. So we just need 3 more cards to cut here. Accumulated Fortune, if we're playing less things that chain, could be something that we cut as well. So yeah, I mean, this would be something to experiment with. So we swap cards like that. I think there's a pretty good Stein TK deck here, maybe. Let's just click Done Siding, see what the test hand looks like here, and see what we get. That is, that ain't a bad hand, honestly. I'm just gonna go 1, 2. Do I set Nightmare Wheel into this? I'm going to set Nightmare Wheel. I'm going to get greedy. If they go heavy, I chain T-Roar and Good Goblin Housekeeping, and I'm fine with that. If they don't, they just bring in a monster and try and attack. I can Nightmare Wheel to, you know, wall it off a bit and deal 500 every turn. So I like that. The next turn I'm drawing into that. I activate Good Goblin Housekeeping, draw a card, put a card at the bottom of the deck. I like them longer, so I could probably put like one of these poisons on the bottom of the deck. And then I could like set this, pass back to them, do things like that. So I like, you know, I feel like I like the cards that I kept in. They're not terrible in a Stein TK side. So yeah, so hopefully that gave you some insight into how to take an existing deck list and potentially adjust it to your own tastes and desires. Now, again, I do highly recommend playing around a lot with an existing deck list to, you know, sort of get a sense for why cards are in the deck initially. I didn't quite do that. I just wanted to jump into making it my own, because generally when I make these videos, I, you know, try and prioritize making or getting duels with decks that I'm going to put in the videos as opposed to just otherwise. But I probably should have just done the research beforehand and played some practice games with the deck as it was. But I do think this is still a fun deck. I'm curious to see how it performs in the video. Let me know down in the comments below if you want me to, you know, play both with the original deck that was at SJC San Jose and the new deck that I made, because I can definitely get games in both those sorts of decks. So let me know down in the comments below what you want to see. And if you want to get games in Stein format or any other format that I feature on the channel, definitely head on over to the YGO from Zero Discord server linked in the description down below. Great place to find games in this format or any other format that I feature on the channel. If you want to support me directly, I also have a Patreon linked in the description down below. Join the Patreon and get a shout out in these videos. So big shout outs to GMYFest, Rinswin, Porkchop, Brendan Donker, Tyler Compton, and Dumptruck. It really means a lot that you all support me this way and encourage me to make more videos like this in the future. But I hope that you enjoyed this video as always. And until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.